Today's lesson is A Swift Rise to Stardom. Hello, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And in our People unit for the month of November, we're going to continue talking about our featured pop singer and actress, none other than Olivia Rodrigo. And we talked about some of her songs from her debut album last time, and they do sound pretty cool if you're into that sort of heartbreak, breakup sort of theme.
Yes, her album Sour came out earlier this year, and it was a big hit. And a lot of the songs on the album talk about adolescent experiences, about breaking up, songs that many young adults can relate to. So it's not easy to write such songs because we might have these feelings inside of us, but how do we actually write the words to a song that people can actually relate to? So this is a skill that Rodrigo actually was able to develop because of another very famous musician.
Exactly, and that other very famous musician, of course, is Taylor Swift. So, of course, she probably idolized Taylor Swift and was influenced by her musical style. So, hence, she owes Taylor Swift a lot to her success. So that's why we titled our article, A Swift Rise to Stardom. So let's do it. Let's continue talking about Olivia Rodrigo in today's lesson. Let's listen to the first part, and then we'll discuss it.
Rodrigo is a huge fan of Taylor Swift, whom she has cited as one of the main influences for Sour. Several songs on the album resemble Swift's indie pop ballads, and Rodrigo even recreated a piano melody from one of Swift's songs on One Step Forward, Three Steps Back, giving Swift and her producer writing credits for the song on the album.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 resemble 指与点点点相像类似，例如 Jason resembles a famous movie star. Jason 长得像一位著名的电影明星，或是 While the two signatures do resemble each other, they're not the same. 那两个签名确实看起来很像，不过是不一样的。另外补充这个字的名词 resemblance, R-E-S-E-M-B-L-A-N-C-E, resemblance.意思是相似处。举例来说 I want to buy a house that has some resemblance to my childhood home. 我想买栋与我童年故居有点相像的房子。再补充一个相关片语 bear a resemblance to 表示与点点点有相似之处。我们可以说 I know someone who bears a close resemblance to Hugh Jackman. 我认识一个长得跟休·杰克曼非常像的人。
So we've already hinted that Rodrigo got a lot of her inspiration for the songs that she wrote from Taylor Swift. So let's look at her influence, how Taylor Swift has influenced Rodrigo. It says here, Rodrigo is a huge fan of Taylor Swift, whom she has cited as one of the main influences for Sour. So she cited Taylor Swift as a main influence for her album. To cite here means to mention as an explanation or an example of something. So I can also cite my father as an inspiration or as a source of knowledge for a lot of the decisions I made in life. So to cite means to mention as an example.
Exactly. And of course, nowadays when you have modern bands, they're often asked, well, who do you cite as an influence? Well, if you're, forming a heavy metal band, you might cite bands like Black Sabbath or Motorhead or Metallica or something. You will cite those as examples or as influences for your music. So here Rodrigo cited or mentioned that one of her main influences for that album was Taylor Swift. And it goes on to say here, several songs on the album resemble Swift's indie pop ballads, and Rodrigo even recreated a piano melody from one of Swift's songs on One Step Forward, 3 steps back, giving Swift and her producer writing credits for the song on the album. That's a long sentence, so we'll come back to that in just a second. Let's go back to the beginning of this sentence. It says several songs on the album resemble Swift's indie pop ballads. To resemble means it's sort of like that sort of thing. You might hear that from your friends if they meet your brother or your sister. Hey, you really resemble your sister. You look like you're twins or something.
Right, so I can say that's true. I do resemble my sister in appearance. I look very similar to her, but I actually resemble my brother in character. So we tend to think more alike even though we don't look alike. And here, a lot of Rodrigo's songs resemble Swift's songs, specifically Swift's indie pop ballads. So indie pop ballads here refer to a particular style of songs. A ballad is a song about love, a love song basically. And indie pop refers to a genre. It's actually independent pop. So pop is popular music. Independent pop is music that is not produced by a major label. So you could say that it's more creative, it's more edgy than regular pop songs. So indie pop ballads is just a way to describe the kind of music that Swift writes.
And she even recreated a piano melody from one of Swift's songs on the song One Step Forward, 3 steps back. So here, she recreated a piano melody. That's different from sampling it. Sampling means you take the original recording and then you do some things to it. You repeat it, you modify it, you lengthen it, and maybe you add other musical instruments to it and stuff like that. But in this particular case, she actually plays it again on the piano. Maybe it's a little different, but it's basically the same.
Yes, it's probably still recognizable as being from Swift's song. So since she recreated the piano melody from that song, she didn't want to take credit for her own song completely. And that's why she gave Swift and her producer the writing credits for the song on the album, which means on the album Sour, for that particular song, Taylor Swift and her producer are cited as the writers of that song.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now to the second part and learn some more about Olivia Rodrigo.
Swift, whose songs frequently portray coming-of-age experiences, gave voice to an entire generation of teenagers. But her millennial fans are now adults, and the torch is ready to be passed. With songs that navigate heartbreak and romance and communicate the fleeting phases of the transition into adulthood, Rodrigo has positioned herself to fill that role for Generation Z.
第二部分我们看到动词 navigate 指操纵、驾驭或是航行，像是 The company successfully navigated the economic crisis. 该公司成功应付了经济危机，或是 The ship navigated through the narrow strait. 那艘船航行穿越狭窄的海峡。另外，除了上面的意思，这个字也可以指确定方向或是导航。举例来说 After living here for 2 years, I can navigate the city streets and back alleys with ease. 在这里生活2年后，我可以轻松地在城市的大街小巷中穿梭。或是 Nick always uses GPS when traveling to help him navigate a new city. Nick 旅行时一定会用卫星定位系统帮他导航新的城市。接着我们看到单字 adulthood， 这个字是名词，意思是成年时期。例如Before reaching adulthood, teenagers should already be making some of their own decisions. 在成年之前，青少年应该已经能自己做出一些决定。或是 In many countries, the age of 18 marks the beginning of adulthood. 在许多国家，18岁代表成年期的开始。
So let's look at how Taylor Swift has influenced Olivia Rodrigo. What is it about Swift's music that Rodrigo found inspirational? So Swift, whose songs frequently portray coming-of-age experiences, gave voice to an entire generation of teenagers. So we have to remember that Swift now is no longer a teenager. She is probably in her early 30s, so she's an adult. She has already passed that adolescent age. However, when she was Olivia Rodrigo's age, when she was in her late teens, early 20s, she was already writing such songs, such love ballads. And in those songs, a lot of coming-of-age experiences were portrayed. So here, coming of age refers to the point at which a young person is considered an adult. And in Swift's songs, which frequently portray coming-of-age experiences, the voices of an entire generation of teenagers were given voice. So their experiences were expressed in these songs written by Swift.
Right, so of course that's a common genre of films and songs as well. Coming of age when you're a child, a teenager, and you're becoming an adult and the things you experience. So that's what some of Taylor Swift's songs are about. They frequently portray or they play the role of these experiences, and this gave voice to an entire generation of teenagers who were feeling that way. This particular generation was feeling that way, and so they could relate to her songs. But her millennial fans are now adults, and the torch is ready to be passed. So we, of course, talk about different generations in Western countries. Millennials are basically in their 30s now, and they're almost 40, whereas baby boomers are in their 60s and 70s now, etc., etc. Yes, most of Taylor Swift's fans are probably in their 30s now, and they're now adults, and the torch is ready to be passed, which means you just have that torch in your hand, which is a bit of fire burning there, and you're lighting the way to the future, and you're going to pass it down to the next generation and let them lead the world now.
That's right. I read somewhere that millennial refers to people born between 1981 and 96. So they should be around between 25 and 40 years old, even though the time frame can shift back and forth by a few years. But that's the general age range. As Roger said, millennials must be in their 30s or maybe even reaching 40 today. So with songs that navigate heartbreak and romance and communicate the fleeting phases of the transition into adulthood, Rodrigo has positioned herself to fill that role for Generation Z. So we have another loaded sentence with a lot of different terms here. Let's start with the beginning. With songs that navigate heartbreak and romance. Here, the term navigate means to follow a path through a difficult situation. So when you go through heartbreak, you have to navigate through it. You have to find a path through this negative feeling. And you also have to find a path through romance when that situation of romance no longer works out. So these songs communicate the fleeting phases of the transition into adulthood, which means that these phases don't last long, even though they may feel like they're lasting a lifetime.
Yeah, fleeting, as Helen said, just is something that does not last a long time. Like, I caught a fleeting glance of a UFO the other day. I thought I saw it flying in the sky, and then it was gone rather quickly. It was a fleeting glance. Maybe it was a seagull or something. I'm not quite sure. But in any case, yes, lots of things happen quickly during the transition phase. Transition means the period of changing from one thing to another, or the act of changing from one thing to another. So you're transitioning from a teenager into an adult, or you're transitioning from childhood into adulthood, which means the period of time that you are an adult, which would be in your 20s all the way until the day you die. So indeed, that's what these songs are about. They navigate heartbreak and romance. They communicate the fleeting phases of the transition into adulthood. And so Rodrigo has positioned herself to fill that role for Generation Z. So indeed, Taylor Swift is kind of the singer for millennials, and they're getting older, and we've got some younger people, and so the next generation is Generation Z, and they're characterized by the fact that they are digital natives. They grew up in a world totally with the internet, okay? Millennials, when they were kids, for a while there were no computers that could access the internet. But Generation Z kids don't know a world without the internet. Believe us, it actually existed at one time, and we did fine. So don't put us down for that, for not having, smartphones when we were 5 years old like you guys all do now. But in any case, yes, the torch is being passed now to Generation Z, and Rodrigo is leading the way.
That's right. So Generation Z refers to those born generally between 1997 and 2012. So they should be around 20, in their mid-20s. More or less in their late teens. And Rodrigo is the voice of the Gen Z generation, and just as Swift was for millennials.
And the younger generation who are in their teens now has a new term. I think it's Generation Alpha, but of course they're still in school, so we don't really talk about them too much. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson. Let's move on now to the third part.
It's no surprise then that Rodrigo has risen so far in such a short time. Her music is vulnerable and relatable, and it beautifully captures the emotional turbulence of adolescence. When you add to the mix the fast pace of the social media age and the universal appeal of the breakup ballad, you're bound to have a recipe for success. Still, growing up on Swift's music can't have hurt.
第三部分我们看到形容词 relatable 指引起共鸣的或是可以理解的，像是 Fans liked the character from the TV show because she was so relatable. 粉丝喜欢电视节目的那个角色，因为它让人很有共鸣。再来我们看到单字 turbulence 这个字是名词，指骚乱或是动荡。例如 Many politicians sense upcoming turbulence for the country. 许多政客已经感受到该国家即将要面临的动荡。最后我们看到形容词 universal 指普遍的、共同的或是全世界的。我们可以说 The universal topics of love and death are often the subjects of literature. 爱情与死亡这些普遍的题材经常是文学的主题。或是 The universal language of music is appreciated by everyone. 音乐这种世界共通的语言能被每个人欣赏。
So we're wrapping up our talk on Olivia Rodrigo, and we've seen that she is a very talented songwriter and singer, and she was heavily influenced by Taylor Swift, who was also very famous for the love songs that she wrote for another generation, for the millennials. And it's no surprise then that Rodrigo has risen so far in such a short time. So because she has been influenced by Taylor Swift and she's had all of these experiences, it's really not surprising that she has become famous in such a short time.
Indeed, it's not surprising then that she has risen so far in such a short time. She's an overnight success, and her music is vulnerable and relatable, and it beautifully captures the emotional turbulence of adolescence. If something's vulnerable, it can be attacked very easily. Young kids, of course, are emotionally vulnerable. They don't have any experience with lost love and heartache and stuff like that. That's why the first time you break up is probably the hardest. And it's relatable. Of course, kids hear themselves when she sings. Teenagers can hear themselves in those songs, so that helps them out deal with this period of their lives. And it captures the emotional turbulence of adolescence. Turbulence means things are just not smooth, like you will experience turbulence sometimes when you take a flight from Taiwan to someplace else. The plane will kind of rock back and forth or shake up and down for a little while.
That's right. When you're an adolescent and you're going through puberty, also that has a lot to do with emotional turbulence because you have a lot of hormonal changes, and that can also affect the way you feel and the way you think. So really, adolescence is a time of emotional turbulence, and a lot of times adolescents can also feel vulnerable it's not a feeling, it's not a state that is related only to younger people. For instance, babies are vulnerable because they can't take care of themselves. They need parents, adults to take care of them. But when you're a teenager, even though you can probably take care of yourself, your body, emotionally you're vulnerable because you're dealing with a lot of experiences for the first time.
Okay, so when you add to the mix the fast pace of the social media age and the universal appeal of the breakup ballad, you're bound to have a recipe for success. So you're adding these things to these various songs here. First of all, you need to consider the fast pace of the social media age. These songs get passed around rather quickly, and people can relate to them rather quickly. And then we've also got the universal appeal of the breakup ballad. Yes, who hasn't had their heart broken at one time in the past? Everybody can relate to that. That's why it's universal. Everybody has had that experience. So if you add those two things to the mix, if you consider those two things together, then you're bound to, or you're probably going to have a recipe for success. So yeah, if you mix those two things together and you create music based on those things, you're going to be really successful. And the last sentence here says, still, growing up on Swift's music can't have hurt. To not hurt in this particular case means it's beneficial. For example, if you're going in for a job interview for a convenience store or something like that, well, yeah, you don't have to wear a suit, but it can't hurt. If you wear a suit, it's probably good too. It's probably the best thing to do, even though it's just a job at a convenience store that you'll probably only have for a year or two. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Let's listen now to our Chinese teacher, Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分有一个句子提到 With songs that... Rodrigo has positioned herself to fill that role for Generation Z. 好，这边用到的句型是 with 加上名词逗号主词加动词去表达有了什么，由于什么。其中这个 with 加名词呢是介系词片语，用来表达出某个条件或者是原因，像是 with practice You'll get the hang of it soon. 透过练习，你很快就会上手，很快就会掌握诀窍了。那还有一个很生活化的例句是 With friends like that, who needs enemies? 有那样的朋友，谁还需要敌人呢？这就像我们中文说的，不怕神一样的对手，只怕猪一样的队友。好，那回头来看看课文的句子，它是用 with songs 来表达条件原因，那么 songs 后面接 that 引导的关系子句是要描述是什么样的歌曲。那他说 with songs that navigate heartbreak and romance and communicate... 然后逗号之后它是主要子句说 Rodrigo has positioned herself to fill that role for Generation Z. 这表示说有了这些成功应对心痛与浪漫以及传达什么什么的歌曲， Rodrigo 将自己定位成替 Z 世代担起这个角色。好，另外文中它用到动词 navigate， 它有这种操纵啊、驾驭或者是航行的意思，在这边是比喻用法，我们用 navigate heartbreak and romance 来表达类似驾驭心痛与浪漫的那种语义。那我们来学习这个字的字首字根。首先看到 ACT 或者是 AG 或者是 IG 这一类的字根带有行动啊、驱使或是付诸行动、起作用的意思。那么在 navigate 这个字当中，它的字首 NAV 有船的意思，字根 IG 表示行动， ATE 是动词字尾，把它合在一起 navigate 就有航行导航的意思咯。我们顺便补充几个有这一类字根的单字。第一个是 agile AGILE， 那它的字根 AG 表示行动、驱使或是付诸行动的那种意思，那么 ILE 是形容词字尾，用来描述具有某种特质啊、某种能力或是倾向，把它合在一起 agile 就可以用来表达是灵活的、敏捷的，是个形容词。那第二个补充的单字是 react， 它的字首 re 表示回复，字根 act 表示起作用，那么合在一起 react 就是表达反应、回应或者是起化学反应的意思。第三个补充的是 activate， 它的字根 act 表示行动，那么 ive 是形容词字尾，不过因为后面它要接上 ate， 所以这个 ive 的 e 被省略了。那我们看到 ate 是动词字尾，它就有使什么什么的意思。好，那组合在一起呢 activate 它的字根字尾表面语义是使什么什么行动，应该就可以联想到 activate 它有启动啊、活化或是使什么活动、使什么活跃的意思了。以上是今天的重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Cite. Ivan cited the weather as a reason for canceling the camping trip. Resemble. Everyone says that Billy resembles his father. Portray. The painting portrays a group of people dancing in a circle. Transition. The school's transition to online learning was swift and easy. Vulnerable. Renee felt particularly vulnerable in the months after her divorce. Universal. The politician's plan met with universal criticism.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Here comes our discussion starter for today. The question is, would you be likely to listen to Olivia Rodrigo's music? Why or why not?
Well, I don't think Rodrigo's music would appeal to me since even though these songs are supposed to have universal appeal, I just don't like breakup ballads. I prefer happy music.
Indeed, I think there should be music that tells us to move on. But, well, I think I would listen to her music because I'm open to all new ideas and I like to hear new voices. And she might have some great catchy songs there, so I'd definitely listen to her music. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.